We continue our state of the franchise by looking at the Seattle Kraken, a franchise up and coming. Of course, last year made the playoffs in their second season. So we're going to look at where the Kraken stand, how they continue to progress and move forward. All that on today's episode of Locked On Sharks.
You're Locked On Sharks, your daily podcast on the San Jose Sharks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, welcome to Locked On Sharks, the premier hockey podcast covering your favorite team in the Bay Area. My name is JD Young, contributor at Inside the Rink. I want to thank you for making Locked On Sharks your first listen, proudly a part of the Locked On Network. We cover your team every day, or at least 3 days a week right now because we are in full off-season mode. I am joined today by Erica from Locked On Kraken. Erica, how's it going?
You know, it's going pretty well. The Seattle Kraken made the postseason much more enjoyable for me this year doing the podcast, and we'll get into it. But I think we've done okay. Still, certainly some things that I'm looking for the team to do in the long run, but I'm feeling pretty good.
Yeah, I know we were talking beforehand. Most of us hockey people are enjoying the offseason. You are full on WNBA right now. No offseason for Erica. So you get like a 2-week break between the end of the WNBA season and then the beginning of the hockey season. So I'm sure you'll be cramming in as much as doing nothing as you can in that time. So, but before we get into the state of the Seattle Kraken, I do want to let you guys know that today's episode is brought to you guys by Birddogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL. Enter the promo code LockedOnNHL for a free white tech hat with your order. You don't want to take off your Birddogs. We promise you. So, Erica, let's start with the state of the Seattle Kraken. They, of course, last year surprised the hockey world, finished fourth in the Pacific, 100 points. Surprised the defending champion Colorado Avalanche in the first round, eventually lost in the second round in 7 games to the Dallas Stars. What are the Seattle Kraken?
Yeah, so I think that's what we're trying to figure out because it was a really tough inaugural season for the Seattle Kraken. We had some experts thinking that we had maybe a top 5, goalie tandem in that inaugural season. That did not come to pass. And so then we were like, all right, well, what are we going to do now with Drieger hurt? You bring in Martin Jones and he surprises. And then we eclipse 100 points. We get into the playoffs. We take out the defending champions in the first round, and we get 14 games in the first 2 rounds in the Stanley Cup playoffs. So I think that the overall feeling is that we have a lot to work with. Mm-hmm. There is momentum that we are able to create. But that also has come with some consequences and some players, certainly some of my favorite players or one of my favorite players leaving the Kraken, which is understandable. And going right back to the additions that we have on paper, are they going to be enough to get us at minimum to what we got last season? But then also knowing that that's a bit of a fool's errand because the Seattle Kraken, for a lot of people, as you mentioned, JD, overperformed. So how do you capture that lightning in a bottle? And how much of that is just kind of playing with house money versus the foundation that is being laid by Ron Francis and Dave Hakstol? And to that point, some of the first off-season acquisitions that we made was to re-sign, or to extend, I should say, both Ron Francis and Dave Hakstol. I believe both contracts take us through 2025, 26. So that's pretty important. And I think that balance of how much of this was just our first run versus how much of this is because we have a team that was actually built to be successful, those are going to be questions that we get answered pretty soon. So feeling good. We have some long-term pieces, which include, I should also mention Vince Dunn. We avoided arbitration with Vince Dunn and we re-signed him. We also avoided arbitration with Will Borgen, both defensemen, so shoring up the back end, critically important there. But yeah, everything else I think is I still have some questions. Goaltending
Yep.
still being one of them for a third consecutive season. I do think there are some questions with goaltending, but overall, state of the franchise is we have done, in my opinion, at least enough to start off where we ended up in our second season.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the actually for the Kraken, like just look a little north to Vancouver, right? They made the Western Conference Finals a couple seasons ago, and it kind of felt like they tried to rush the process, right? And it feels like
Yes.
the Kraken are going to be slow and steady. And yes, they probably overachieved a little bit last year, and this team, I still think they lack a superstar right now. Matty Beniers is well on his way to becoming a superstar in the NHL. But it feels like they trust their process, and if maybe they take a step back this year, and maybe it's a first round exit, or maybe they just miss the playoffs, but it feels like they're setting themselves up for long-term success as teams. Maybe in the Pacific, you look at like Vegas isn't going to be this good forever, right? Who knows what happens with Edmonton, but like you feel like they're on the rise and going to be a long-term player, maybe rivaling the Kings here, I think, in the future in the Pacific. So this offseason, right, it did feel, there was a lot of talk. Of course, the Kraken could be looking to make a big impact as potential Erik Carlson suitors. Of course, we know Erik Carlson went to Pittsburgh. Your thoughts on them kind of staying the course with this buildup of the franchise?
Yeah, it wasn't surprising to me that we were in the mix from reports, but did not kind of finalize and close that deal. I like that the Seattle Kraken were at least considering the option. The Seattle Kraken are a team that have been very mindful of the salary cap. We have been able to gather a lot of assets through trade deadline and then getting draft picks. And those are still assets that I think we still comfortably enjoy. So I think the Erik Carlson conversation, while I have been on the record a lot on Locked on Kraken saying, I do think we need a little bit more of a dynamic superstar on the team at any position, and that I would like to see us shore up defensively. I think perhaps
Carlson does one of those things, not the other.
And so it's all about the timing. I think that I don't think that Carlson hurts the Seattle Kraken, certainly not in the short term, but it's a matter of if Ron Francis and company felt that the deal that would have been in place to acquire him in the long run would have hurt, like you were saying, like I had said earlier, what the team has established foundationally. And I think it was just a little bit too steep of a price for right now for the Seattle Kraken. But I like that we were in the conversation. I like that players continually talk about the Seattle Kraken as being a destination that's intriguing to them. So I think that will pay dividends eventually. I'm a little bit uncomfortable that we're still kind of waiting on that superstar, but I understand overall why that was the decision that the organization made.
No, again, it makes sense. You don't want to rush a process like this. And yes, getting a guy like Erik Carlson on your team is going to make you a better team. But I think you have to feel like, again, you don't want to fall into that Vancouver trap of like, hey, we made the Western Conference Final, or we made the playoffs, like, let's go for it now. And then all of a sudden you don't, right? And then you're kind of stuck in that situation of, well, we kind of spent all of our assets already, and now we're kind of stuck with this team and know where to kind of improve or get better. So before we get into the Kraken's offseason, we're going to look at your draft. Relatively quiet free agency. Maybe look at some misses potential, or what could have been for the Kraken. We'll talk, of course, about Matty Beniers and Shane Wright. Do want to take a quick break. Talk to you guys about our good friends over at Birddogs. And I'm wearing my Birddogs right now because they just feel great. If you're like me, right, the weekends are super busy. You usually got soccer in the morning with the kids, and you're probably at Costco or Target. Then maybe you're cooking out. Maybe you're going to the brewery. Your whole day is busy. You need some shorts that'll take care of you and make you look good no matter the situation. That's why I go with Birddogs. They're super comfortable. They have anti-stink sweat wicking fabric. So again, living in Fresno, it's 110. You don't have to worry about, just everything getting all gross and bunched up and that. So go check out Birddogs right now. And when you do, go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL. Enter the promo code LockedOnNHL. They'll send you a free white tech hat with your order. That's birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL. Promo code LockedOnNHL for a free white tech hat. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off. We promise you. Okay, so let's start with the draft. So the Seattle Kraken, of course, picked 20th in the draft. They took one Eduard Sale, who's already got his ELC. Thoughts on Sale, who was, kind of one of those mid-round pick, kind of mid-first round picks, and I think fell a little bit to the Kraken at 20, and they already like him enough to have signed him to his ELC. So Eduard Sale, pretty solid start.
Yeah, I think so. And so Eduard Schala, I'm learning how to pronounce at least his name. There's some further down the list that I still got to work on. But so he's from the Czech Republic. As someone who covers international hockey, first thing I want to say is that the Czech Republic women's, men's youth programs on both sides have been fascinating. They are playing a dynamic and exciting, a strong and hard type of hockey. So that alone, just knowing how international hockey is trending, again, on both the women's and men's side, I was already intrigued. He has some familiarity with some of the scouting team at the Seattle Kraken, and so that means that we also knew his type of game. Now, I think this is definitely, he's a winger, and so this is something down the pike that could really develop into some dynamic scoring. Doesn't give me what I love, which I know you say defense is for nerds. Well, call me Urkel because, I love me some defense, but, he fits into the molds for the Seattle Kraken in a lot of ways. What do you know, or what do we hear about Eduard Schala? We hear that he has great ice vision. You hear that he's got good speed. He's got good size. He seems to be a player that can take things in stride. He doesn't get too hot, too cold, too high, too low. And so those are all things that I understand to be paramount for the Seattle Kraken, especially in prospects, because they want to be able to develop young people in their system, starting, of course, at some point with the Coachella Valley Firebirds, and then work them into what, at least right now, is still a very, as Dave Haxtell would say, lunch pail, grinder, kind of humble, playing with a lot of humility, and also playing by committee. That's where we were able to overachieve, is because everyone bought into doing what was necessary to get the win and putting aside some of that ego. And so for that, I think Eduard Schala really makes a lot of sense. I will also say, JD, as a baseball fan, the fact that he was able to go out first one right down the middle. That was amazing. And then they were like, "Did you practice?" He's like, "No, never threw a baseball in my life." So that immediately caught my eye. But going back to the hockey, I think Schala is an intriguing pick for us. Like you said, maybe fell to us. We certainly know what it's like as the Kraken to have a player fall to us. And I'm sure we'll get to that a little bit later. Yes. But I think, early returns from the development camp that happened right after the draft is that he was a good fit, seemed to be comfortable on the ice. And now it's just about growing his size, strength, and skill to be able to fit what the Kraken need when he comes up to the team.
Yeah, looking at the Kraken's draft, I love some of the picks. Very much in the defenses for nerds, go score points. Lukas Dragicevic, who the Kraken picked 57th overall. I was pounding the table for the Sharks to pick him at 26 because he is that Erik Carlson, all gas, no brakes type of defenseman. I know you're going to probably pull your hair out watching him at times, but I think you need to take swings on players like this, right? He, with the little bit smaller defenseman that he is, they're either amazing or they never make the NHL. And that's kind of the boom or bust. But picking him at 57th overall, where, again, a lot of people had him as a potential end of the first round pick. And Dragicevic, like that guy provides offense. And if you're looking for a potential superstar, like I said, he's either going to be a superstar or you're never, ever going to see him in the NHL, kind of like the Ryan Merkley, right, type of player. So, but again, getting him at 57, love that. And then Caden Price, who I also really liked in the draft process as well, who, again, looking at as a potential pick for the Sharks at number 36. Getting him, way back at 84th overall. I feel like the Kraken really added some quality pieces to their blue line with both those picks. So again, I know you're very much defense, but Dragicevic, you're going to love Dragicevic, I promise.
I'm looking forward to it. And I think, again, you kind of describe players that we have in the pipeline. We've had, a couple of drafts, or I guess this will be the third that we've gone through as a franchise. And you start to see some trends, like you said, maybe what would be considered undersized defensemen. You think of maybe like a Ty Nelson, and then you think of dynamic forwards that, it make or break. A lot of people looking at Furcus, who we will not see in the AHL this coming season. That's not the expectation. But, he's really been putting on a great show for Moose Jaw. And so I think it's going to be curious to see. But and sometimes I think if you look at NHL teams, that might be concerning. But everything that I've heard, that I've seen, and that we see on paper is that the Seattle Kraken organization is really committed to developing players, and they have a pipeline that is consistent enough that it will fit into the Kraken system, while also, we saw what the Firebirds were able to do. And so there's a little bit of that give and go that you have to have, right? The give and take, the push and pull between having an AHL squad that is going to have enough players that are NHL ready, or at least be able to do that two-way, while also still competing and being effective in the AHL. So I'm very curious to see how some of these guys fit into that.
All right. And then with the free agency, again, the Kraken were pretty quiet for the most part, right? Kind of mostly just taking care of their own guys with here, while still maintaining a pristine cap sheet over the next couple seasons. Do you feel like this maybe was a missed opportunity to maybe try to go add an impact player? I know it wasn't the greatest free agency, or do you, again, like to kind of stay the course, and next year, what should be a more impactful free agency, maybe kind of open up the purse strings a little bit next year?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I think just knowing what the potential is, I can say for myself, I was kind of like chomping at the bit to see, all right, like what can we get that can really push us to the next level? And so that we're not necessarily clawing to get the results that we did last year, but we're a little bit more comfortably in that conversation. But to your point, I'm not sure that the Seattle Kraken really saw what they wanted in the field. And that's okay. I'm getting better at being more comfortable with it. I think for now, we talk about on Locked on Kraken a lot that there's like a 3 to 5 year plan for the Seattle Kraken, and we're entering year 3, at least on the ice, I should say, because the Kraken's been working at developing for a while. But if we look at just on the ice, we're in year 3. So I'm okay that it didn't happen in this free agency. I am looking for the team to get a little bit more aggressive when it comes to the trade deadline and next off season. But I think it's worth noting that we did make some moves, and that includes players that we did not keep with us. I mentioned Martin Jones. He's going to try his luck and see what's going to happen in Toronto. Carlson, you've mentioned Vancouver a few times, but that's a player that not really a big surprise. Even at the trade deadline, there's some rumblings there. And Carlson, I think, is the type of defender that as we want to mature a little on the blue line, I think that certainly in the fan base, there were some people that were questioning if he was necessarily the right fit there. And then the Seattle Kraken's fourth liners, as far as forwards, were really impactful at a very critical time for the franchise and for the team last year. And so that's Ryan Donato, Morgan Geekie, and Daniel Sprong, who came in on a PTO and worked his way onto the roster. All three of those guys, including Donato, who's one of my favorites, they are playing elsewhere. Donato's going to be in Chicago. You've got Geekie that's in Boston now. And Daniel Sprong, I thought, got a pretty nice contract out of Detroit. So what are we going to do to replace those minutes? We have an entire episode where we talk about the raw numbers of points, right? Or more so goals. How many goals are we losing and how many did we gain by adding, we have We have Brian Dumoulin, who we brought in. And then as far as forwards, you have Kyler Yamamoto. That's a pretty big one, especially with his ties to the area. And then Pierre Eduard. So, I don't think we have not, at least goal for goal, we have not, based on last year's numbers, made up the goals that those fourth liners have given us, with an extension to Dunn, with a maybe more healthy and effective, not just Andre Burakovsky, but will Bjorkstrand get into the flow, kind of like we saw at the end of last season and in spurts in the playoffs? Jaden Schwartz, I think, still has more that he can give us. So I'm not concerned per se, but if you look like for like, just in the goals, and we talked about this on the podcast, we still have a little bit that we need to make up.
All right. Before we get into the 2023-24 preview, do want to thank you guys for making Locked On Sharks and Locked On Kraken your first listen. Again, proudly a part of the Locked On Network. We cover your team every day. If you want to be an everydayer, all you got to do is just follow along wherever you get podcasts, or you can like and subscribe on YouTube as well. Okay. What is the best and worst case scenario for the 2023-2024 season for the Kraken?
Well, I mean, I think we start with the worst case scenario. I think for me, that's the Seattle Kraken not finding a way into the playoffs again. Is it the absolute worst thing that can happen? No, but I do think as far as that 3 to 5 year timeline, and knowing that the Seattle Kraken have prided themselves on wanting to be a team that when they make the playoffs, that they will be a team that stays in the playoffs, that could really put a chink in the chain of what this team has built itself on, which is its culture. It's, again, kind of blue collar, hardworking mentality. And in a vacuum, if we don't make the playoffs again, that is going to really take us down a notch when it comes to really the narrative and the culture that we're trying to build. And the reason I say in a vacuum is because whether I think the Seattle Kraken did enough or not, we have to also look at what's happening, not just in the Pacific Division, not just in the Western Conference, but obviously throughout the league. And there have been much more aggressive teams in the league. And how are they going to make a jump? I mean, we saw the jump that the Kraken made, but also we saw the jump that the Devils made. And then there's been teams in the Pacific Division. And I'm sure as you continue to do the state of, the state of the franchise in the Pacific Division, especially, there have been teams in the Pacific Division that have been right there, and we were expecting to be right there this past season, and they took massive dips. So for me, that's the worst case scenario, just looking at what the Kraken want to do outside of what anyone else has going on. So the best case scenario is that we advance past the second round, right? Because that's the bar that has been set. I do think, and I talked about this so much on Locked On Kraken, but the fatigue factor for me was disappointing. Not shocking, but it was disappointing. And so I've said this a lot on Locked On Kraken. I'm expecting a very intense training camp. I'm expecting a very intense preseason, not just because there is going to be competition for certain roles, including players like Ty Cartier or maybe Riker Evans from the Firebirds that are looking to make a roster spot. Shane Wright, a little bit of a different situation because between the games that he's played and all of the different, agreements between the leagues, he's kind of just on that cusp. So we might have to see if he's offered another exemption to even be eligible. So we'll see where all of that lands. But if all roads and paths are open, he's another player who's going to be competing for an NHL spot. And so for me, again, best case scenario for this team is just that they improve upon what they did last year. And last year, that was 14 games through 2 rounds. And so if they can minimize the number of games through 2 rounds and, get to 3, I think that would be best case scenario for us.
All right, let's talk Shane Wright, because, Wright last year, of course, the presumed first overall pick fell to the Kraken at 4th. Had a weird season, right? I think he played for at least 20 teams last year, it felt like, at least. But, he bounced around, went back to, started in the NHL, went back to the OHL, I was traded in the OHL, played in the AHL playoffs. What with Shane Wright, is it better just to maybe just send him back to the OHL for the season? Go do your thing. We'll see you in April when your season's over type of player for him. Like just maybe some consistency for him and have like playing on one team for the entire year. Is that you think maybe the best opportunity for him, or do you think he might be ready to push for an NHL job right now?
I do agree with you with the consistency. Last year was whiplash, not to mention just everything from him falling to 4 and the stare and then him being with the Kraken but not suiting up. I think consistency and giving him the opportunity to build on what ultimately ended up in being, I would say, a pretty convincing campaign in the AHL with the Firebirds as they made their push for the Calder finals, which they made, ultimately fell to Hershey. But I do agree that consistency is what Shane Wright needs. I do not think that what's best for his development is to go back to the OHL. And that's, again, where all parties involved. And, Ronnie Francis talked to us in media about that, and that the Kraken are, on behalf of Shane Wright and alongside his representation, trying to get all parties involved to do what's best for his development. I don't think Shane Wright needs more time in the OHL. I could see a scenario where he could use consistency in the AHL before being ready to make that big push to the NHL. But ultimately, like I was just saying prior to your question, I also think that the maturity of Shane Wright has increased. He was a leader for that dev camp coming right off the draft. He didn't have to come, and he made a point to be there and to take leadership in when it came to the prospects. And that was something that we weren't really seeing in his first camp. And so I like that. If you hear what the Firebirds had to say about him, he really started to step into his own, play a more physical game, and win a lot of pucks for that team, again, who made a play all the way to 7 games in the final against Hershey. So consistency, yes. OHL, no. I don't have a good read right now, though, whether that means he'll spend the majority of his time in the AHL or if he'll make that jump to the NHL. But again, I think that comes to our training camp. I think that comes to some of the players that I mentioned that we signed that are on 1-year deals or, maybe 2-year, two-way kind of situations, because I think there are some positions that are really up for grabs. And that's what I love, because we do need guys that are going to come with the intensity right away, because we fizzled out. The Firebirds fizzled out in the playoffs. The Kraken fizzled out in the playoffs. And so the more competition that there is for spots, the more that the teams or the players, are really going to have to run through their paces. And I think that's only going to benefit both the AHL team and the NHL team when it comes to the dog days of the regular season and then trying to make a push for the playoffs.
All right. Who's the most important player for the Kraken this season?
Philipp Grubauer. Goaltending woes, I'm still a little perplexed by goaltending. So we haven't mentioned Joey Eduard. He had a great season for the Firebirds, came up to the Kraken every once in a while. Philipp Grubauer looked good. It looked like he exercised some of those demons. We made a goalie change. He was looking more confident, really more comfortable with the Kraken in front of him. I think he was buying into whatever systems and whatever changes came with that goalie change with Steve Briere coming in, and then he got hurt. And we knew we didn't have Chris Drieger available, so that's when we leaned a lot on the aforementioned Martin Jones. Philipp Grubauer was amazing for us in the playoff run, solid. I do think, just like everyone else on the team, he suffered from some fatigue, but not in the same way that I think we kind of dropped the ball as far as the skaters. He was the rock. And so if we can tap back into the Philipp Grubauer that we got at the end of the regular season last year and through the playoffs, that's going to really help anchor this team, because Martin Jones, he was all over the place. And I will say, I was the first one to say some of the, exactly. I don't have to tell you, but some of those wins were definitely more on the lucky side, but he did what he needed to do. You hear it a lot in hockey or in sports, right? Making the right play at the right time. And that was Martin Jones for us while Philipp Grubauer was on the mend. Chris Drieger spent time backstopping Eduard, actually coming back from his ACL surgery. So For me, it's got to be Philipp Grubauer. As much competition as I think there's going to be in training camp, I do not want it to be for the starting role as goaltender. I want Philipp to own that. And then really, I do think that the Kraken are going to give Joey Decord, as Ronnie Francis sometimes says, every opportunity to make the Kraken roster. And he's going to have to go head-to-head with Chris Driedger, who, again, is coming off of surgery, did not get a lot of repetitions last year comparative to Philipp Grubauer, who did. And again, Joey Decord, who did at the AHL level. But for me, it's got to be Groupie.
Makes sense. Yeah, I mean, goaltending is the great decider of all for hockey. And having watched Martin Jones turn into a pumpkin for 3 straight seasons, I totally understand that. So, Erica, let's get you out on this. Where do the Kraken finish in the Pacific this year?
So we were in the Locked On NHL preseason poll. I believe we came in at 7 in last year's poll, and I said we would shoot for 5, and then we came in at 4, so that's not bad. I think we really have to take command of our fate. So I'm gonna say we finish 3rd or better in the Pacific Division. Really make it inevitable as much as possible that we get into the playoffs, and then see where we go from there.
All right. So how do you have the Pacific stacking up then? If you got the Kraken at 3rd, they got to jump somebody.
Yeah, I know. Oh gosh, I
know that's the fun part, because everyone's like, "Oh yeah, we'll fit it," and then you try to order them, and you're like, "Oh yeah, I got to actually order them."
Yeah, if I had to say right now, I think presumptive number 1, Vegas has earned that. I'm inclined to say Edmonton, and then I think we leapfrog the Kings. That's what we'll have to do. That's what we'll have to do for my prediction to be correct.
There you go. Erica, you've said it all. Where can the people find you?
You can find me, of course, on whatever we call social media these days at Locked On Kraken, and then personally at elindsay08. That's ELINDSAY08. And then just like Locked On Sharks, you can find us anywhere you listen to podcasts and on YouTube.
And of course, you can follow Locked On Sharks wherever you get podcasts on YouTube. You can follow the show on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at Locked On Sharks. You can follow me on Twitter and Threads at My Fry Hole. And until next week, bye, friends.